crowd. Vincent is a lifelong member of this area. He was born less than a mile away from here. He taught in our elementary school. He went to our university here in Flagstaff. He's recognized as a historian. He has an unbelievable memory. Besides all that, he's a wonderful friend. But before he speaks and introduces himself, I have a few announcements to make. I'll keep it short. What's your name? Please, my name is Ruth Wicks, and Edith and I, Edith, raise your hand, are co-chairs of the First Friday events. Anyway, it's so exciting to have you here. You're going to be blown away. He's very, very good. If you have hearing issues, this room has, people have difficulty hearing in this room. Great. So in the future, if you do have hearing issues, always sit in the front. Almost everybody has their own phone. I would like for you to take that phone out now and mute it. You don't have to turn it off, just mute it. If a phone goes off, we're setting a new rule. You'll have to have give a $10 donation to the Historical Society. Okay, I'm doing that right now myself. Okay. Let me see. Finally, and we haven't really been good about this in the past, but the Historical Society is growing. We have a great need for people to become members of this group and to consider volunteering. Now, there are two reasons why you'd want to volunteer. We have a lot of fun. We party quite a bit. Number two, it's extraordinarily worthwhile. People are hungry for these kinds of events. We want authenticity, we want the truth, and we want to know about our past, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. So I would like the women, Carol Kane, raise your hand please, Jeannie, okay, and Artist, raise your hand. Those three women, as Cindy's here, our past president, any of us will help you fill those forms out or take your names down. So on that note then, I think that's it. We now are honored to have Vincent Randall speaking.
That's Apache for good morning.
Good morning.
I am a Yavapai-Apache, and I'm going to introduce myself to you if you were all Apaches sitting out there. I'm in the Meh, which means I'm a member of the people. And I belong to the subgroup Diljan Apaches, which means Diljan comes from the word going hunting, so we're the hunters. There are 6 subgroups of Apaches in the southwest of the Athabascan-speaking people. We are a matrilineal society, and we follow our family line through our mother's side. My mother's side was a Yuana, which is our clan name. A clan name is a geographical area from where we came from. It's a country that we roamed. Yuana, in my case, means over the top or on top of the rim. The timber country, all the way from Flagstaff to Sholo. We roamed and even all throughout the country. I was given as a gift to my father people, who was Kaizenti. which means the willows growing out of rocks people, which is just a little north of Payson. My matrilineal grandfather was a Hokaya, which means the grinders, which was a country down there by Roosevelt. And my paternal grandfather was a Chevaniste, which means people surrounded by rocks people, which came out of Yavapai down in the lower part of the state. I said that I was glad to be here today to tell you the story of our people and share things with you and what happened to us in the past. But before I do that, I would like to introduce my family here. My wife is sitting here. Her name is Erie, and she grew up she's a native of Clarkdale. And my two cousins here, and my brother back there, Vernon, he's sitting back there. He's a Marine veteran, went to Vietnam twice, and came home. And my two cousins here, we're all related because our roots go back to two sisters. Our great-grandmothers were sisters. We have Linda, Jane, and their son, Maury. They're here with us, which I'm very happy to see them. Today, this is the month of February. In our language, we call it the moon of Sasnalagi. Sasnalagi means the time when the snow melts. It's the moon of the time when the snow melts. That's our name for February. And some things happened in that time back in 1875, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, and generally called the Exodus. Before the Exodus, before any European ever crossed the ocean, the Yavapai-Apaches roamed most of what is central Arizona, all the way from the San Francisco peaks and all the way down through Yavapai. Generally speaking, east of the Verde River. All of the Yavapais, generally speaking, roamed west of the Verde River all the way out to the Colorado River. Quite an extensive territory. So that when the land claims were settled back in 1969, the Yavapais were given compensation for 10 million acres. And the compensation wasn't really very much, it was only 50 cents an acre. The Apaches on the east side were, of course, the territory wasn't 10 million acres, but we had better resources, so we were paid off for $1.25. So that's the picture that the country that we roam. And beginning with the situation concerning our people, is that basically I'm going to skip directly to the causes and effects of the Exodus and what happened. But basically, during the gold rush days, miners and prospectors came west. And lo and behold, they found gold at Lynx Creek, which is over in the Prescott area. And of course, that was Yavapai territory. And who knows who fired the first shot? Or whatever it was, miners were being shot at, miners were shooting back at the Yavapais. The miners asked for help, and so the army came west and set up a fort, which is known as Fort Whipple. Still today, Fort Whipple is still there. And so a massive campaign took place against the Yavapais, so that by 1868, most of them were subdued. And some of them, one group that was in the far southwestern part of Arizona, out in the desert. They were captured also. They were taken to La Paz, which is what is Parker, Arizona today. And that particular group that were rounded up there, they're extinct today. The story is that, and it's probably true, is that smallpox blankets were distributed to them and they all died. But the other groups of Yavapais then were rounded up and put on a reserve called the Camp Date Creek Reserve in 1868, which is just north of Wickenburg. Before I continue on, I would like you to understand there are three kinds of reservations. There is the original reservation that was done through treaties, which is an agreement between the United States government and the tribes. And it was passed through Congress, signed by the president, and it was a law. Then came Ulysses S. Grant in the middle 1860s, and that kind of reservation was done away with. And he introduced what we call an executive order reservation. And what he did is that he sent out what he called peace commissioners out into the field. And these peace commissioners then went out and, with the Army's help, tried to bring peace on the Western Front by offering the tribes to come in and surrender, and they would be given a piece of land to live on and be protected and taken care of. That's an executive order reservation, and that began with Ulysses S. Grant around 1867. The third type of reservation is a congressional reservation, and there is only one tribe today that broke the barrier in 1972, and that is the Payson-Tano-Apache community. They passed a bill through Congress, signed by the president, and by President Nixon, and on October the 6th, 1972, they became recognized and were given land as a reservation. So you have three kinds of reservations. The one that was set up at Camp Date Creek was an executive order reservation. Then the campaign turned to the east as Prescott grew, as Fort Whipple grew. The entrepreneurs came with them, and then, of course, they have to eat, so the farmers came, the ranchers came, and now we have a thriving community in what is now Prescott, and other eyes are now set to country on the east side. And so the farmers came over first in around 1860 and set up farms, 19 of them, I believe, at the juncture of West Clear Creek and the Verde, and begin to do the farm and started farming. And of course, for us Apache, that was really a good thing. It was like setting up a Circle K store on the corner. Because that gave us the opportunity, as they raised their corn and their melons and so forth, and we began to raid them. And just as a side note, some of our language today comes from that era. I know it does. Today we call watermelon Tsekoidana. Tsekoidana means you eat it at night. And the ranchers also came over with their cattle. And today we call barbecue Tsekochina. Tsekochina means you smell it at night. Because they didn't cook it in the daytime, they cooked it at night. Because the ranchers and the soldiers could see the fire, the smoke from it, so they cooked it at night. So you smelled it at night. So today, we call barbecue Tlekochina, you smell it at night. We call watermelon Tlekoidana, you eat it at night. So fires were, again, the records show that there was some conflict that started to take place. Protection needed to be dealt with, and so the soldiers, the contingent came over the hill, and Mr. Cowan here, we collaborated. He's an historian also, collaborated on some issue, and they set up the first camp down there by the river near the cornfields today. Out there, made it Camp Lincoln, and Camp Lincoln was along the river, and this valley at the one time it must have been pretty warm and so forth, that there were malarial problems, and Camp Lincoln eventually was moved up to where Fort Verde actually is today. But a massive campaign began against the Apaches then as the settlers started coming over the hill. And the army was out on a search and destroy mission. One of their strategies, of course, was to destroy our food and keep us on the run. And they did that successfully for 11 years. And we fought as much as we could, but we were always on the run. We couldn't farm. A lot of times people say that Apaches and so forth weren't farmers. We were farmers. We farmed. We had garden plots, and we raised corn and beans and all this vegetable. And basically the system was that wherever we were, we started the planting in the spring, and the people that were able and so forth started to keep the weeds out of there and get the growth going. And then as the season comes in, which will be at the end of next month into April, then the people that were able to travel and so forth then began their move to places where the natural foods were ripening, because one of the main things was that's how we sustained ourselves. We lived off the land. We went, and wherever the crops were beginning in May, we harvested the agave. We roasted the agave bulbs, the stalks. We burnt and chewed like sugar cane, and we moved across the land. And in the meantime, the elders that couldn't really travel that much, they stayed with the plants and at the home base. And they're the ones that raised those crops. So that when the people came back in the fall, which is the moon in September, we call it the moon of the big harvest, the chaw and the stomp, we say. In that moon, then the people all came back together and get ready for the winter. So that's how we lived upon the land. And then in came the army and chased us around. And so in our case, Peace Commissioner by the name of Vincent Randall came out west. In the meantime, General Crook was the general that was in the field against us. First of all, there was a man named Woosley out of Agua Fria down here south of Dewey, and he had a militia, citizens militia out of Prescott, and he did a campaign against us, but he didn't find us. I think he only found 1 or 2 Indians. But that was unsuccessful. But as the army grew and General Crook came, General Crook then did one of the, probably a very important thing at that time. He was a real Indian fighter, and his philosophy was, he said, it would take an Indian to catch an Indian. And so he employed the Apache groups on the east side, but it's now Fort Apache Reservation, which is White River, and Fort Apache and so forth. And he employed them as scouts. And of course, these scouts knew how we lived and where we went, and probably some of them were our own relatives. But he used them against us, and used them every day, and was successful enough that by 1871, the first group of Apache groups and the clans were the Yuana, which is what my family belongs to, over the rim people up there, and Tuskesalai, which means the two mountains in a row, the people out of the East Clear Creek, which is southwest of Winslow today, the Gutchilla, which are the people here around Perkinsville, the Chechen, which are the Red Rock people, and the people here in the Verde Valley, the Yavapai, the White Land people, and the people, what we don't call Squaw Mountain, Squaw Peak. We call it the Senator Stein, which means where the porcupine sits and suns himself. And so these are the porcupine people. And all these people, together under their leader, Justin Nez, came in and surrendered in Cape Verde in 1871. Then later, with an extensive campaign in the Tana Basin, the Nagazoking, the Crooked Water people, the Chisnananai, the Walnut Standing people, Nuscho, the big Manzanita people, and Chistatan, the people by the side of the mountain people, the Sidikayan, the White Sand people, all of these different clans under the leadership of Yavapai, which means white, gray hat, came in and surrendered also in 1871. So altogether there were something where close to around 700 to 800 Apache groups had come in by 1871 into Cape Verde and said, we're tired of running, we're tired of being pursued every day, our children are hungry, and our women have nothing, so they came in, especially with Yavapai. Yavapai came in with his people from the Tana Basin country, and he said, look guys, as he surrendered at Cape Verde, he said, we're not afraid of you white guys, but we can't fight you guys and our own people at the same time. And so we're tired. We want to come in. And they came in. And that was what the peace commissioner offered, that if they came in, they would no longer be pursued, they would be safe on the land that would be given to them. So in 1871, this is what Vincent Coiler set up as the first reserve. It's called the Cape Verde Indian Reserve, also called the Rio Verde Reserve. Now, down at the bottom there would be a point right there where, pretty close to where I-17 and the Verde meet down there by Cape Verde. Then you follow the river all the way up to just south of Paulden. And anything 10 miles east of the river and 10 miles west of the river was given to our people by surrendering. And that is 450 square miles, because it was 45 miles up the river and 20 miles, or 10 miles on each side, which makes 900 square miles, was set up as a reserve for our people. And the last outfit to surrender to come into Cape Verde was a group that were fighters along the mountain country from the Matsutsal and all the way down to Yavapai. And they had a leader by the name of Teshche, which means the Red Ant. And the Red Ant came in and surrendered in 1873 at Cape Verde. But he didn't like it. He didn't like the reservation, so with some of his followers, he left. And so Crook went after him and offered a $50 reward for his head to be brought in. And of course, $50 was a lot of money in those days. So 3 heads came in saying that this was this was Cha-Cha. And so we never know for sure which one was who. But some of these people would stay in the Verde Valley. So now we have a reserve, we have the Apaches coming in, surrendering. Then in 1873 and into 1874, an executive order reservation is what I call a cheap reservation. It's as useless as the ink on a piece of paper. Because what happens in an executive order reservation is the president, through his peace commissioner, can say that this is a reservation, this is the condition, but at the same time, the next day, the executive order can be taken away. And so that's what happened to the Yavapais over on the west side, over at Camp Day Creek. Remember, they came in 1868, and they were set up at Camp Day Creek. And in 1873, their reserve was revoked, and they were marched over here to the Rio Verde Reserve in 1873. Now, lately we've been doing some research, and we find that a lot of them didn't want to come, and they escaped. So they also had to be hunted down and brought and forced over here on the Rio Verde Reserve. So now we have the Yavapais and the Apaches on the reserve, and when you set up a reserve, then because you promise safety and you promise provisions and so forth, which is what the federal government promised, then you have to have an agency, and you have to have a superintendent of the agency, you have to have a contingent of soldiers and so forth. So they set up the first agency right over here at Peck's Lake. And again, one of the problems that the soldiers faced when they first came over and set up Camp Lincoln was the same situation over here, that there was poor conditions because of the malaria and also other conditions. So they moved the agency to Haskell Springs, which is just west of Yavapai College today. And at that time, I'm sure, with the water table the way it was back in those days, it was running. That creek was running. I know that it was running, and the springs were running. So they set the agency up there. And the Yavapais that came over in 1873 set up their camp around the agency. The Apaches were set up their camp in what is now Dead Horse Park. And they began to dig a ditch, in which then they started farming over there at Dead Horse Park. So they also were induced to raise oats and hay for the army and the horses. And so they were doing a good job. And the Yavapais also dug a ditch. The late Paul Henry, the geologist that used to live in Clarkdale, he found the ditches that were dug by the Yavapais at Haskell Springs. And I would imagine what is now the vineyard out there at Yavapai College, that's where they set up their farms. And they were farming out there also. So things were going pretty good. But it was because things were going too good, the entrepreneurs out of Tucson. Now remember that the railroad system only ran through southern Arizona. There wasn't any railroad system coming across northern Arizona at the time. So the rations, things that were brought north to supply the Indians because they were supposed to take care of them, came out of Tucson. But first of all, before I tell you that, when we first came in, and my mother used to tell me that her great-grandmother used to tell her the story, and my grandmother used to tell me the same story too, that when they first offered the rations to them, One of them was flour, ground white flour. And our people didn't even know what to do with it. Some of them said, what are we supposed to do with this thing? They said, well, you're supposed to eat it. Well, the story goes that there was a Mexican, I'm sure he was a scout, part of the scout contingency, and he showed them how to make tortillas. And that's how we started making tortillas. They gave them beans, and they did know something a little bit about beans. They boiled them. But the other thing that they gave them was the coffee. But they gave them as coffee beans. And they told them that the way this is a drink, you boil it. They didn't know that they had to grind it up and so forth. And they boiled it, and nothing ever happened. And then they also issued potatoes to them. And they said, what are we supposed to do with this? And they said, well, you boil it and you eat it. So they boiled it, and they boiled it so much that it was just mush. And they said, this is useless. So we had to learn how to, our diet changed, and we had to eat. And one of the most terrible things to me that happened at that time was that when we started receiving rations, this is what happened. Instead of working with our hands and being out on the country, sustaining ourselves, here our people became open their fingers, open their hands for a handout. And that philosophy is still within us today. Our tribal members always want more, 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 instead of using their hands. So societal changes took place, and some of them bad. But anyway, so here we are on the reservation, on the reserve. And now we have a group of people in Tucson, known as the Tucson Ring, which was a group of entrepreneurs that were supplying the supplies to the reserve up here and other places. And their concept was, they said, it's costing us too much and cutting into our profits. What we need to do is get the War Department, who handle all the Indian problems, we need to get them to understand that we need to put all the Indians close to Tucson. And so they went to the War Department and induced the people in power to put these people closer to Tucson. So the word went out that the Rio Verde Reserve, again, like I told you, could be done away with a stroke of a pen the next day. Well, that's what happened to us. By the Tucson Ring and getting the War Department to change their mind, Ulysses S. Grant did away with this whole reserve. And on February the 26th, 1875, we packed our bags and we began our march out of here. The best account of this whole situation that took place is a doctor. Dr. Coubossier is the way I pronounce it. He was the doctor for the reserve, and he had his camp out there at Haskell Springs. But before we marched out of here, word came from San Carlos, which was the destination where we were going to be taken. And a runner came from San Carlos onto the Apache side. So that before the march took place, somewhere around 400 Apaches left from Dead Horse Park and dispersed out into the wilds. into Fossil Creek, Oak Creek, up Sycamore Creek to hide out. They didn't go. In the meantime, according to an article written by Gertrude Smith, the Yavapai-Apache Cultural Director, and the Verde Valley Archaeological Society newsletter, she wrote that the Yavapais were happy to learn that they were moving to a new country. According to her, in her article, she wrote that the Yavapais over at Haskell Spring held a big party, had a big bonfire, and they danced all night before they left for San Carlos. I don't know about that, but that's what she says. Albert Nelson, the Yavapai Cultural Director for Fort McDowell, when we did the commemorative walk 2 years ago at Yavapai College, said in his talk that all the Yavapais went, that none of them went and tried to escape because they feared for their life, that the army was going to kill all of them if anybody left, so they all went. So that sets the stage. So on February the 26th, the contingent of Apaches that are left, which includes our great-grandmother, both Jane's great-grandmother and my great-grandmother, they started on the march, but their parents, as my grandma used to tell the story, their parents said, we're not going, and they left with the other people. And they went back up in the mountains. And in the meantime, they began. And the cook, you know, he, even though he was ruthless in trying to round us up and everything, he also, to me, had a humanitarian heart, because he tried to influence. This is, you know, he left immediately, not too long before then, but if we were to be taken, he wanted them to be taken around on an easier route, so around by Phoenix and easier way. And, but the man that was put in charge was a man by the name of Dudley. And Dudley came in, and his job was to the removal. And his famous words were, they're Indians, they're beggars, let them walk over the trails. So the trek was across central Arizona through a treacherous trail. Now, somehow or another though, some of the older people, and this is from a man that was my, for the Apache side, he was my great uncle, Billy Smith. He said that his dad, whose name was Tonto Joe, was hit by a rattlesnake and he was crippled. He survived, but he was crippled. And he told me that he got taken by a wagon around through the desert. And then we have a story about one of our relatives, a clan member, and she also was taken around. So some of them did get taken around to Phoenix in an easier way. Billy Smith also told me about his father, Tonto Joe, and what he said. He said that, you know, when we came in and surrendered, and I don't know where this big rock is, but he said they set up a big rock, he said. They set up a big rock, and they said, as long as this rock stands up straight, all this land here will be yours, as long as that rock stands. So when the word came that we were going to be taken out of here, Billy told me that his dad said, I guess the rock rolled over and cracked. That's why we're going. And so they left. And according to the doctor, it was a very pitiful sight as people lined up. And because the Apaches and the Yavapais were enemies, they put the Apaches in front and they put the soldiers in between. And there wasn't a lot of soldiers. From what I can gather, there was something like 15 to 20 with some scouts and others under an officer by the name of Schuler. And so the Apaches were put in front, the Yavapais in front, and they marched out of Haskell Springs at the agency, and it took them 2 days to get to Camp Verde. And they stayed in Camp Verde for 2 days or 3 days, and then started the march again and went as far as West Clear Creek, and it snowed on them, and it was cold. And then they began the long trek out towards Hackberry Mountain and on down into Hackberry Springs, and then along the trail into Fossil Creek. These are old trails that the Apaches used, and they followed that trail. Now, as I understand, and Mr. Cowan can correct me, I believe the mule skinners were the Hanses, and they were the mule skinners, and they're the ones that had the provisions on the mules and so forth, and there was a contingency of cattle. But with all that rough country and so forth and cattle, I'm sure that the cattle was slaughtered early. So anyway, and there's a man by the name of Grenville Goodwin that came out west in the 30s and interviewed a lot of Apaches down in San Carlos. And he interviewed a man by the name of George Kidd. And George Kidd also talks about the march and into Fossil Creek. And one of the things he talks about is in Fossil Creek that again, another contingency of Apaches left. They escaped that night and went up into the canyon and stayed. And today, one of my helpers, one of my cultural specialists, who celebrated her birthday yesterday, she's 86 years old. And her family never went to San Carlos. They hid out in Fossil Creek. And we've done archaeological surveys, and we found camps and so forth in Fossil Creek. And one of the items we find were canned food. And these Apache guys that were hiding out would raid these army, because later the army came back and tried to hunt us down. But anyway, they got their supplies, and there's canned items of 1875, 1880 vintage. So anyway, the march continued. It went out of Fossil Creek, went up to Hardscrabble Mesa, and then on down into a place called Doll Baby Ranch today, which is on the East Verde. Along the way, probably around Hardscrabble is my guess, or going up Fossil Creek, they had run out of food, and food was getting scarce. And according to the account, Al Sieber shot a deer, and the two groups all ran to the deer, and a conflict arose, but the soldiers with them were able to quell the conflict, and as far as I know, there were no casualties. But they fought over that deer. And as they went up over the top into Hardscrabble Mesa and down towards Doll Baby, there they were really starving, and tempers rose. And from the account from the doctor is that the two groups got into a conflict. The Yavapais went after the Apaches fought back. According to the doctors, 7 casualties, not counting those that got wounded and maybe went off somewhere and died. And But that was the second conflict, that there was a fight between them. And again, the soldiers with Seaver, and then they called the riot and brought peace back. Now, the conditions along, not only was it a tough one, but also the creeks were running high. The West Clear Creek, Fossil Creek, Strawberry Creek, the East Verde, and personal stories is that some of the soldiers were kind enough, and I've heard the story from our elders, were kind enough that they put the little kids on the back of their horses with them and took them across the creeks. Most of the others, they stretched ropes across the creeks, and the people then crossed the creeks in that manner. And lives were lost, especially the elders. And they died, drowned. So that as they left and went down Rye Creek towards what we call Jacob's Corner today, to the confluence of Tonto Creek, that things were pretty bad. They were starving, they didn't have any food, so Dudley or Schuler sent people from his small troops to San Carlos to Agent Clum. And Clum got the word that they needed, so that when they crossed the Salt River, which again was flooded and tough to cross, that when they did get across, that Clum did bring food for them. In our personal story, my grandmothers used to say that the two parents, our great-grandmothers, Jane and I, that this was about where, when they were going towards Rye Creek, that those old people came and said, and caught up with the contingent, and they said, we're going to San Carlos with you. We went back to our home, but we just was too lonely. We just can't take it by ourselves, so we decided to come. And so they joined the march somewhere around below Payson, is the way my grandmother used to tell the story. So now the provisions and all have, and people are eating, and the final march was into San Carlos. But before then, I also heard a story from one of our elders, one of my father's cousin, and from his side of the story, he told a story about how also word got back to San Carlos and to the Apache people, and they said, look, our relatives are coming, and they're sick, and they're weak, we need to help them. And so all those that had horses, all those that had some kind of a wagon, they all went, and they met them at a place called Pinto Creek. And they all loaded them, those that were sick, those that couldn't walk anymore, and they took them into San Carlos. Now, in the front of our cultural center today, we have a statue. It's a statue of a man, and on his back is a burden basket and a woman. And this is from the doctor's account. He didn't say it was a Yavapai. He didn't say it was an Apache. All it does is he describes an older man had a decrepit wife, and he cut holes in the burden basket. He had a burden basket for harvesting wild, edible things. Cut holes in them. He carried that, his wife, 180 miles. And that is a statue that we worked hard to put up, because I think to us it commemorates the tenacity and courageous heart and the will to live in all conditions. And that we still need that today. So that statue means a lot to us. It stands out there. So now we're in San Carlos, and in the meantime, the Rio Verde Reserve goes back into public domain. And that's how we were taken out of this country. We were taken out of our land, and we now are spending our years for the next generation in San Carlos in a concentration camp. We couldn't leave the reservation. We couldn't do anything. If we left, we were hunted down and we were shot. Now the people that still hid out in this country, Fort Verde still existed, and our own people became scouts and came back north, and they were known as Company B under Al Sieber, and hunted us up through 1879. And we're still hunting us. So by 1889, after Geronimo was captured, just as a quick note, soldiers kind of let things slide. And the other thing was, the town of Globe was growing. It was a mining town. And they needed two things. They needed wood and they needed hay. Wood, because that's what they cooked with or what they heated with. No natural gas or anything in those days. Transportation, mules and horses, and they need hay. So they allowed the Apaches and Yavapais to cut hay, cut wood, and sell it in Globe. And they give them a piece of paper and they said, this person, blah, 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 is a good, trusted Indian. First green pass. First green card. Then, labor was to a minimum, so when the Roosevelt Dam was being discussed, then the agencies, the superintendent of the agencies, was contacted to hire Apache labor. Apaches built the Roosevelt Dam. The Italians were the stone cutters, the Apaches were the laborers. So anyway, that's the next story that I can tell one day of how we came back and how we ended up here. And that's another story. But that is the Exodus story. We commemorate what happened to us, not really to celebrate, but in memory of those that survived, and because of them that we're still alive today. And we commemorate that day with different events. We have a commemorative spirit run from San Carlos to Camp Verde. We have a solemn sunrise to noon. We go to Boynton Canyon, which is one of our holy places, for a blessing ceremony. Then we come back and we do a commemorative march from the Veterans Park to the Cultural Center. And then noontime arises and we commemorate and celebrate the time for coming home. And we have a community lunch, cultural performances, and that ends the day for us. We remember the time that, and we remember the people that survived and had the courage to live, and that's why we're here today. So, the Exodus story. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. You did a wonderful job. We want to thank you. Those are very hard memories for all of us on both sides, how inhuman we can be to each other. But we have a very nice honor today. Bill Cowan, who is the historian on Beaver Creek area, has several items that he would like to give at this time to Vincent, which are treasured historical items themselves. I'll let Bill talk about it, and then I'll say a few words at the end. Bill, why don't you come over here?
Thank you. And I got to say that listening to Vince Randall tell the story is just a real treat. They're also fortunate to have decided to come today. And as somebody who has followed the history of the birdie, which included those people who were here before, it has been my privilege over the years to visit with Vince. And one of the things that Vince mentions is this, is the formation of the Rio Verde Reservation. And when the Yavapais were moved from Dade Creek, along with them came a doctor whose name was Corbusier. And the interesting thing about Corbusier is that he was not only a doctor, but he was also a bit of an anthropologist. And he documented his story through a diary, which then his son put into a book called From Verde to San Carlos. And so it is with tremendous pleasure that I present this book, Verde to San Carlos, to Vincent. So we have something else to argue over, to discuss. Oh yes, and there's an interesting inscription inside. Corbusier's son published this book in 1971, and he dedicated it and sold it to somebody else. I suspect he sold it, but in any case, it's an autographed copy. And then I have included an inscription below that. Another interesting thing happened because it's unfortunate. There was a book that was sort of like this book that came out afterwards, but the Verde de San Carlos is out of print. And the copies are rare and hard to find, but in this day of the internet, you can look up all the stuff and it doesn't really matter. An interesting thing about it though was that Corbusier's son was having a difficult time getting this thing into publication. And so for all of those books that he had pre-sold, he sent these individuals that had already bought the book an illustration. Have I got this thing right side up or upside down? The illustration is on a frontispiece of the book. And there were only about 50 of these ever printed. And as a student of Corbusier, here came then this thing on eBay, and I happened to buy it. One of very few copies of this. And then over time I got to thinking, you're getting old, you're going to die one of these days. Probably ought to give this to somebody who then may be able to keep that as a memory. And so it was with that I want to give this also to Vince. It's the same as this photograph right here, but there were not very many of them. And the amazing thing was when I bought the thing on eBay, you know, eBay's anymore got to be where it's impersonal. But here was this woman who had received it from her uncle's estate, and she was so thrilled to find anybody because it was on eBay for a while. She was asking way more than I was willing to pay for it. But after I bought it, she sent along all this sort of interesting documentation and was so glad that somebody had understood what her uncle had done. So anyway, here's the balance. And it is a privilege and an honor to get to hear Vincent's story. Thank you.
That wraps it up pretty much, but I want all of you to check your phone. We have a missing phone, and we think that somebody inadvertently picked it up when they thought it was their phone. So if you would check that, we'd be most appreciative. And if you do come across it, you can leave it here with any of the women at the door. Just a second, Vincent has one more thing to say. Just a minute.
Also today, since I got a gift as a book and so forth, I also would like to let you have a gift, a book also. A book we wrote for really it's for our children that we wrote it, but it's a lot of historical accounts about our people. And as you leave, Mike Lindner will be passing these out if you want a copy.
Wonderful.